welcome to this episode of the Philosophy of Child Rearing. In this episode, we're talking about the joys of parenting and the challenges of parental guilt and regret. I'm Luara Ferracioli, an associate professor in political philosophy at the University of Sydney, and I work on issues such as family justice and the philosophy of immigration. I'm joined by my colleague and collaborator from the University of Sydney from the discipline of philosophy, Ryan Cox, who works on the philosophy of education, amongst other things. Now, full disclosure, Ryan and I have 3 children together. We've also recently been working together on a project with our colleagues at the Sydney Social Sciences and Humanities Advanced Research Centre on justice in early childhood education and care. We're both very excited to be joined by our special guest for this episode, Hannah Tierney, who is based at UC Davis and is the parent of one delightful baby boy. Hannah works on issues in metaphysics related to personal identity, on forgiveness, and a topic that's very relevant for us today, on the philosophy of blame and guilt. Welcome, Hannah.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, I remember when I was pregnant of my first child some 10 years ago, and a friend of mine said, the thing about parenting is that you feel guilty all the time. And I remember thinking, why do people feel guilty if they're doing a good job at parenting? But then I had my first child, and yes, I realized that you are constantly feeling guilty about your decisions. You feel guilty when you're at home, but you wish you were at work, or when you leave them at daycare for longer than you intended. You feel guilty if they're not exceeding at a milestone, or if they're not eating or sleeping very well. The list goes on. But I want to start with you, Ryan, because I can't help but think that this is more about motherhood than parenthood. Ryan, do fathers feel guilty?
Of course they do. I can't speak for all fathers. I'm sure that there are some that don't feel guilty because they don't think that parenting is their responsibility. But I think that even that type might have their more reflective moments when they wonder whether they should perhaps be more involved in parenting. Anyway, I certainly have moments of parental guilt myself. I had a moment recently when I thought that we should be working harder to get our boys to eat vegetables. That was pretty minor. I guess I avoid parental guilt by avoiding doing the kind of things that would trigger it. I think that I'd feel pretty guilty about spending too much time at work. So I just try to make sure, in anticipation of that guilt, that I don't end up working more than I should. I often consciously make an effort to put work aside to focus on the kids at the weekend, for instance, partly to avoid that feeling of guilt.
Me too. I also feel guilty about them not eating enough vegetables. Or, not reading to them every night, or not breastfeeding them for as long as I could have, or not making sure they do all the extracurricular activities other kids do. Our 4-year-old's still not doing swimming class. I feel very guilty about that. And I feel guilty even when I make decisions that take the possibility of guilt into account. Hannah, why do mothers feel so guilty about their decisions?
There are likely many sources of parental and specifically maternal guilt. I think the potential for guilt is high in any context where there are clear and/or strongly internalized expectations or goals for what we should be doing. And parenting is definitely a context in which this is the case. Most parents don't want to be average or good enough parents. They want to be excellent parents, or even the best possible parent they can be. And with a goal like that, it's almost impossible to not fall short of it at least a few times a day. And we are also being increasingly inundated with information about how we should parent better. And this creates its own set of expectations to fall short of. And often this information is deeply inconsistent, making it impossible not to fall short of at least one expectation. A recent example from my own life. A TikTok video went around one of my parenting groups a few months ago about how socks are terrible for babies. They cut off their circulation to their feet and they prohibit them from fully engaging with their environments. The same week, my parents came to visit, and my mother could not believe that I didn't have my 8-month-old in socks while he was playing indoors. And this was summer in California, by the way. Now, in reality, I think both the TikTok influencer and my mom were at least partially incorrect. Socks are most likely not evil, but they're also not always necessary. But given the vehemence with which people offer parenting advice and our intense desire to do everything we can to parent well, It can be very hard to not feel guilty about failing to do everything people say we should do to parent well, even when it's impossible to do so, and even when much of what we're told to do is unnecessary or even pointless. And everything I've said here typically impacts women and parents gendered as women to a much greater degree, since much of parenting advice is often directed at these individuals.
Exactly. And we should not forget that there is such a thing as maternal ideology. And that maternal ideology tells women that nothing gives them as much happiness as their children, and that their children's well-being rests entirely in their hands. So I guess the first step is to recognize that maternal ideology is a real phenomenon and that women are often placing possible demands on themselves. Hannah, do you think that this is the right analysis of what's going on?
When you're told your entire life that having a child will be the most important and meaningful thing you can do, as women and those who are gendered as women often are, it's impossible to not have that impact you in a pretty big way. I think this makes mothers not only more likely to experience guilt, but it also expands the range of things over which we feel guilty. We feel guilty not just about our parenting decisions, but also how we make those decisions, how much time we put into making those decisions, how we feel about those decisions, how we feel about our children, how we feel about our parenting, how we feel about ourselves. The list goes on and on.
And also, the thing with maternal ideology is that it also tells women that they must make significant sacrifices for their children, and that such sacrifices are a source of happiness. So in Brazil, for example, we say that to be a mom is to suffer in paradise. Hannah, how can we push against this ideology?
One way to push against this is to interrogate our own experiences of guilt. So guilt is an important emotion, and sometimes it's good to feel guilty. Guilt can give us information about the ways in which we are failing and how we can do better. But sometimes our experiences of guilt are misleading. We aren't actually doing anything wrong, and there isn't a reason to behave differently in the future. So when we start to feel guilty, it's good to reflect on what exactly it is we're feeling guilty about, why we're feeling guilty, and what we can do about it.
I think that's really important, Hannah. And in your own work, you've reflected on the nature of guilt. Can you tell us a bit more about the nature of guilt and how maybe thinking about the nature of guilt can help us kind of respond to our guilty feelings?
So there are several distinctive aspects of guilt as an emotion. One of them is a propensity for counterfactual thinking. So when we feel guilty about something we've done, we often find ourselves thinking about all the things we could have done differently to avoid doing the thing that we feel guilty about. And I think this is a reason guilt can be so recalcitrant in the parental context. There is no shortage of salient alternatives to every parental decision that we make. We only have to look at a parenting book or a parenting magazine or a parenting website or other parents in our community or online to get a clear sense of how other people make decisions differently. Another important aspect of guilt is how it motivates us to act in the future. Guilt is said to have a reparative function. Experiencing guilt motivates us to address our past actions, typically by making amends to those we've wronged, and by pushing us to behave differently and better in the future. And when it comes to parental guilt, there are often no reparative actions that we could or should take, or ways that we could or should change our behavior.
That's right. And that becomes quite apparent when it comes to childcare decisions, no?
Yes, the decision for what to do about childcare is a particularly fraught one, and one where guilt seems almost inevitable for many mothers and parents gendered as women. This is because many of us have internalized inconsistent expectations, thanks in large part to maternal ideology. On the one hand, mothers and parents gendered as women are expected to serve as the primary caretakers for their children throughout a majority of their childhoods. They're also expected to want and desire to play this role. And if we don't, then we're cold, unloving, or neglectful. On the other hand, because we live in a misogynistic world, full-time caretaking roles are not typically valued, and we are also expected to pursue careers outside of the home, can contribute financially to our families, and so on. And we're expected to want these things, and if we don't, we're thought of as lazy or boring, or worse. It's impossible to fulfill both of these expectations at the same time when we have young children. And what's more, what we want for ourselves and our financial realities might come apart drastically from these pictures of what motherhood and parenting should look like. This can lead to a sense of failure and feelings of guilt.
So what do you do then? What kind of questions should we be asking ourselves once we reach this point?
it's coherent and probably very tempting to ask ourselves what we could have done differently in the past that would have led to different childcare decision. We might wonder, what would have happened if we'd pursued a career that allowed for more time off? Or if we had married a wealthier person? Or if we had chosen to live closer to our extended families? Or if our extended families had chosen to live closer to us? But when we ask the reparative and forward-looking question, this doesn't generate any adequate answers, right? In pursuing a particular childcare option, who have we harmed or wronged? No one. If a parent has thought about these decisions carefully, then it's very likely that they have chosen the best available option for them and their child. And when we ask ourselves the reparative question, we're again likely to come up empty. To change our childcare decision would either be impossible or would most likely not make the child better off. So when we find ourselves in these situations where there's nothing to be done about the guilt that we're feeling, there's no positive way forward, I think these are the cases in which we should pause and critically reflect on why it is we feel guilty in the first place. So once we're able to identify that we feel guilty not because we've harmed someone or failed to live up to a standard that we actively endorse, but because we failed to live up to an impossible or harmful standard, maternal ideology will start to lose its grip. Now, this is a very daunting process, and fully eradicating harmful maternal ideology will take a lot more than individuals coming to terms with how it negatively impacts them on a day-to-day basis, but it is an important step to take and one that will hopefully mitigate many unhelpful and painful experiences of parental guilt.
Now, I think much of that kind of rings true to our conversations in the home about childcare. Luara spends a lot of time thinking about childcare options. Should we be moving our son to a different childcare? Would he be better off in one place? And when she asks me these questions, I just kind of flip a coin in my head and say, well, that sounds great, or that sounds great. They all sound equally good options to me. But Luara's obviously trying to think what would be the best option for our children, whereas I just think they'd all be pretty good, so it doesn't really matter, and we're not trying to maximize kind of helping our kids.
So moms are often trying to be the best parent they can be.
And dads are just good enough.
You are listening to The Philosophy of Child Rearing.
Okay, so we all recognise that parenting can be hard, and in particular that it can be particularly hard for women. I want to turn the discussion to a sensitive yet under-discussed topic, the topic of regret in parenthood. As a society, we're pretty comfortable with people expressing regrets about careers, choice of partners, house ownership. No matter how much you work to buy a house or to land a certain job or to get someone to go on a date with you, it's perfectly reasonable to tell your family and friends later on that you regret those decisions. And yet, there seems to be a taboo around regretting parenthood. Are parents entitled to regret parenthood? And what should they do if that happens?
So I don't think that parents have done anything wrong when they feel regret about becoming parents. Regretting having children is a difficult and painful experience, and how people respond to that regret can go better or worse. That can lead them to make bad and harmful decisions. But the feelings themselves are not in and of themselves morally objectionable. Whether we regret something or not is not typically under our direct control, so even if parents were somehow not entitled to feel regret, the question still remains, what should they do about it if it happens to them? And it seems clear that some parents really do regret having children. Of course, it's very difficult to know how common a phenomenon this is, since, as Ryan notes, there's a taboo against talking about it. And in some ways, this taboo makes sense. Talking about regretting buying a house doesn't harm the house. But if a child hears that they're unwanted or that their parent regrets having them, it can be deeply painful and damaging. This doesn't mean that parents shouldn't talk about their regrets.
It's hard to know, right, if people are regretting the relationship they have with a particular child or regretting parenting in contemporary Western societies. Parenting in today's society is quite challenging, with many people just lacking the necessary level of support. We know plenty of academics, ourselves included, who had to move for work or live somewhere without extended family. So when people are trying to combine full-time work with child rearing and still try and retain aspects of their former selves, they might come to regret finding themselves in that position. Maybe in a world with free early childhood education and care and longer school days, with more financial support from the state, maybe people would be less likely to regret parenthood?
I take your point, Luara, about societal support, and I think that it's a part of the puzzle. But isn't there also a risk that you regret the relationship? What if your relationships with your children just don't work out as you thought they would? Hannah?
I think that is definitely possible. I think it's likely that even in an ideal world where parents receive adequate support, there will still be some people, possibly many people, who do not enjoy occupying the parenting role and wish they hadn't taken it on. I think this is true of almost any role a person could occupy, so I don't see why it wouldn't be true of parenting as well. There are surely some people who will not find the benefits of parenting particularly valuable, and parenting is so hard and children require so much, even in the ideal circumstance. There are surely going to be people who just don't find the benefits to be worth the many, many costs.
So I think this connects with questions about the ethics of procreation. If people go ahead with procreation because they have some fantasy about what the relationship with their child will be like or what kind of person their child will be, then I think there's a serious risk of regret. But isn't the whole point of embarking on this project that you simply do not know what you will get? And now that you've created a vulnerable creature who needs your love and care, you better love her deeply and robustly as opposed to indulging feelings of regret. Hannah, I guess the question here is, do parents have a moral duty to love their child?
So I think that parents have a duty to love their children, or perhaps lovingly care for their children, as others argue. But I think that this is compatible with regretting having had children. Again, I think one probably does have a duty not to tell their children that they regret having had them, but love or loving care does not preclude the feelings of regret. In fact, I wonder if parents who, because they love their children, have had to make huge sacrifices in order to protect and care for them, might be more likely to experience regret than parents who do little caretaking work. An absentee parent who sees a child once or twice a year may not regret having had children because they bear little costs associated with caring for them. But a parent who quits their job to provide care for a high-needs child, goes into debt in order to pay medical bills, and ends their marriage over conflict related to caring for the child, they may understandably feel some regrets. Loving your child and regretting having had them is an extremely painful position to be in. In cases like this, I agree that it's important for the parents to find ways of dealing with their regret that do not inhibit them from lovingly caring for their children. But this will likely involve being honest, at least with themselves, about how they really feel about their choice to become a parent, instead of denying their feelings or attempting to ignore them. It may be necessary to talk with a therapist or a counselor, or even with others who share their feelings in anonymous online chat rooms, for example.
So our conversation so far has been pretty heavy. I'd like to lighten the mood a little bit and talk about the joy of child rearing. My children make me laugh every day, and it's hard to imagine what my life would be like without them. I certainly have no regrets. Although I would no doubt have more time to write philosophy papers, my daily life would be pretty joyless without my kids. Luara and I are middle-aged people who are already a bit jaded. And it's through our kids' eyes that we get to experience a lot of awe and excitement about the world. So, Hannah, what are the joys of parenthood, and how do we get to experience less guilt and more joy?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask about this. I'm so new to it. So I think that if I hadn't had children, my life would still be quite joyful, maybe equally or even more so. But it's very heartening to hear you and Luara reflect on the joys of parenting, and it makes me hopeful and optimistic for the future. So watching Asa, my son, learn about the world has been an incredible experience. He recently learned how to climb the stairs, and he's currently trying to figure out how to climb down the stairs. And getting to be there for him and support him and literally catch him when he falls has been quite moving. And I can't imagine how I'm going to feel when he learns how to solve equations or cook a meal or read his first philosophy book. Hopefully it's mine.
You've been listening to The Philosophy of Child Rearing with our special guest, Hannah Tierney from UC Davis. Hannah, it's been an absolute joy to discuss these matters with you today.
Thanks so much for having me, Ryan and Luara.
This podcast series is presented by the Discipline of Philosophy in the School of Humanities at the University of Sydney and was recorded and produced by Peter Adams. These interviews were recorded on the traditional lands of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation.